On Christmas Eve, 1945, a quiet home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, became the center of one of America's strangest unsolved mysteries. The Sodder family, Italian immigrants who had built a modest life in the Appalachian foothills, went to bed after an evening of gifts and celebration. By morning, 5 of their 10 children had vanished, leaving behind only ashes, questions, and a silence that has lasted for decades. George and Jenny Sodder were well known in their community. George ran a small trucking business and was regarded as hard-working and outspoken. He had strong opinions, particularly about Italian politics, and had criticized Mussolini even when many local Italian Americans still supported him. Some later wondered if his political remarks might have earned him enemies, but at the time, the family appeared ordinary, respected, stable, close-knit. That night, December 24th, the Sodder house was filled with warmth. 9 of the 10 children were home. The oldest son was away in the army. Around 10 p.m., Jenny told the younger ones it was time for bed, but 5 of them, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, aged 5 to 14, begged to stay up and play with their new toys. Jenny agreed, on the condition they turn off the lights and lock the door when they were done. She then went to bed with George and the baby. Around 12:30 a.m., Jenny woke to the sound of the telephone. A woman's voice asked for someone Jenny didn't know, then laughed softly before hanging up. Jenny noticed that the lights were still on, the curtains open, signs that the children hadn't followed her instructions. She turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and went back to sleep. About half an hour later, she awoke again, this time to the sound of something hitting the roof, followed by a rolling noise. Moments later, the smell of smoke filled the house. When she opened her eyes, flames were spreading through George's office, near the fuse box and telephone line. Jenny screamed for her husband and children. The house erupted into chaos. George and Jenny escaped with 4 of their children, Sylvia, the baby, and 3 older siblings who had slept upstairs. But when they tried to reach the remaining 5, the staircase was engulfed in fire. George shouted their names, but no voices answered. They escaped outside, desperate. George tried to climb the wall to the children's window, but the ladder that always stood against the house was missing. He then ran to start his 2 trucks, hoping to drive one beneath the window to climb in. But neither engine would start, despite having worked the day before. Water from a nearby barrel was frozen solid. By the time neighbors arrived, the house was nearly gone. The blaze consumed everything within 45 minutes. By dawn, only ashes and a smoldering foundation remained. The fire department, delayed and short-staffed, didn't arrive until 8 in the morning. When they finally sifted through the debris, no remains were found. Not a single bone. The fire chief suggested the blaze might have been hot enough to cremate the children completely, but that explanation never sat right with Jenny. She began to test it herself. Burning small bones from animal carcasses, she discovered that even after hours of intense fire, bone fragments always survived. Experts later confirmed her instinct. A house fire, even one lasting several hours, would not reduce human bones entirely to ash. Something didn't add up. In the weeks that followed, more strange details surfaced. The missing ladder was found at the bottom of a nearby embankment. A telephone repairman told George that the home's phone line had been cut, not burned. A neighbor reported seeing a man stealing a mechanical block from George's trucks the night before the fire, which could explain why they wouldn't start. Another witness claimed to have seen a car parked near the house, with people inside, watching. Then came the sightings. A woman working at a Charleston hotel claimed she saw 4 of the missing children with 2 Italian-looking men and 2 women about a week after the fire. The children appeared nervous, and the adults refused to let them speak. Years later, another woman reported seeing photographs of the missing children in a magazine, in which one resembled a child she had seen at a boarding school in New York. None of these leads ever led anywhere definitive, but each one rekindled hope for the Sodders that their children might still be alive. The official conclusion from state police was that the fire had been caused by faulty wiring, but that explanation conflicted with George's experience. The lights had remained on during the fire's early stages, something impossible if the wiring had shorted out first. The Sodders became convinced the fire was deliberate. George believed his outspoken criticism of Mussolini had made him a target, and that someone had set the fire as revenge, taking the children in the process. It was a theory few outside the family took seriously, but it reflected their growing conviction that what happened was no accident. For years, the Sodders kept searching. They rebuilt their lives, but never stopped investigating. George poured much of his income into private detectives, newspaper ads, and nationwide appeals. In 1949, the family hired a pathologist to re-examine the ashes. A small piece of vertebra was found, human, but belonging to someone aged 16 to 22, older than any of the missing children. It was later discovered that the fragment had not been from the site at all, but likely placed there from a nearby cemetery during testing. The mystery only deepened. Then, in 1968, more than 2 decades after the fire, Jenny received an envelope in the mail. It contained a photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back, written in neat cursive, were the words, "Louis Sodder. I love Brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35." Louis was one of the missing children. The resemblance in the photo was striking. The same eyes, the same curve of the mouth. George and Jenny believed it might truly be him. They hired another investigator to track down the sender, but he vanished without a trace. The Sodders eventually built a large billboard on Route 16 near their home, showing the faces of the missing children and offering a reward for information. It stayed up for decades, a silent monument to a mystery that had no ending. Tourists would pass by and see the photos of 5 smiling children and the words Fayetteville, West Virginia, Christmas Eve, 1945. It became part of local memory, a story both tragic and haunting. As time passed, theories evolved. Some suggested that organized crime might have been involved, possibly in child trafficking or retribution against George for refusing to work with certain groups. Others thought the children may have died in the fire after all, but their remains were simply not found because of incomplete searching. Yet nothing definitively closed the case. Each clue seemed to contradict another. Every logical path led to uncertainty. Jenny wore black for the rest of her life. George continued to investigate until his death in 1969. None of the Sodder children who survived the fire ever stopped wondering what had really happened that night. Whether the missing 5 perished in the flames or were taken away remains one of America's quietest and most personal unsolved cases. Not a headline-grabbing crime, but a family tragedy that sits between possibility and grief. What makes the Sodder story so enduring is not its scale, but its silence. It's the image of a Christmas night turned to smoke, the lights still glowing in the distance, and parents standing in the cold, looking toward the hills for answers that never came. The fire consumed the house, but not the mystery that remained, smoldering quietly for generations. And somewhere in the tension between loss and hope, the story of the Sodder children continues to drift. Not sensational, not solved, just unresolved. A memory frozen in time, waiting for the one piece of truth that might still be out there. The Atlantic Ocean is vast, but in December 1872, a small merchant ship named Mary Celeste would become one of its most haunting mysteries. It wasn't a tale of pirates or storms, nor a ghost story born from sailors' imagination. It was a real ship, a real crew, and a real disappearance that left even the most rational minds searching for an answer that made sense. The Mary Celeste was a 282-ton brigantine built in Nova Scotia in 1861. By the early 1870s, she had already changed owners several times, passing through rough luck and repairs that seemed to follow her name. In 1872, she was captained by Benjamin Briggs, a respected seaman from Massachusetts. Briggs was a man of faith, discipline, and experience, the kind of sailor others trusted to bring a vessel home safely. With him were his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, along with 7 crew members. Their destination was Genoa, Italy, carrying a cargo of over 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. The journey should have been straightforward: cross the Atlantic, deliver the goods, and return home by spring. The ship set sail from New York on November 7th, 1872. The weather was fair, the crew in good spirits, and nothing about the voyage seemed out of the ordinary. But less than a month later, the Mary Celeste would be found adrift thousands of miles from land, in the middle of the Atlantic, empty. On December 4th, 1872, the British ship Dei Grazia spotted a vessel drifting erratically between the Azores and Portugal. Captain David Morehouse, commanding the Dei Grazia, recognized it almost immediately. He had dined with Captain Briggs just weeks earlier in New York. But what he saw now made little sense. The ship's sails were partially set, but tattered and loose. It moved without direction, as if left to the wind. No one was visible on deck. After repeated hails and no response, Morehouse sent a boarding party. When they climbed aboard the Mary Celeste, they found silence. The deck was wet but intact. The cargo hold was secure, and the barrels of alcohol were accounted for, except for a few that seemed to have leaked. There are no signs of violence, no struggle, and no bodies. The ship's lifeboat was missing, suggesting the crew had abandoned ship. But why? Below deck, the scene was eerie in its normalcy. The crew's belongings were still in their quarters. Clothes were neatly folded, personal items untouched. In the captain's cabin, Sarah Briggs's sewing machine sat on a table, beside a vial of medicine and her daughter's toys. The captain's logbook recorded routine entries up until November 25th, about 9 days before the discovery. The last note placed the ship near the Azores, sailing steadily. There was no indication of panic or trouble. The Mary Celeste was seaworthy, though it had taken on some water about 3.5 feet in the hold, which was not unusual after weeks at sea. The compass was damaged, and the ship's chronometer and sextant were missing, vital tools for navigation, perhaps taken in the lifeboat. The most pressing clue, however, was absence itself. Not a single soul was aboard, nor was there a trace of what had become of them. The boarding crew steered the ship to Gibraltar, where a British Vice Admiralty court launched an official inquiry. Led by Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General, the investigation turned almost theatrical. Solly Flood was convinced foul play had occurred. He speculated that Captain Morehouse and his men from the Dei Grazia might have plotted the disappearance, murdering the crew for insurance money. But this theory quickly fell apart. There was no evidence of violence, and the cargo's value was modest. The Mary Celeste's owners eventually received their insurance, but the case had already captured the public's imagination. With no proof of crime, the vacuum of explanation invited endless speculation. Some believed the crew mutinied, though by all accounts, Briggs and his men were disciplined and well paid. Others proposed pirates, but the ship's valuables were untouched. Another idea suggested alcohol vapors from leaking barrels might have caused an explosion scare. If fumes had escaped into the hold, a small burst or chemical reaction could have frightened the crew into abandoning ship temporarily, only for disaster to strike as they drifted away in the lifeboat. It's one of the few theories that seems at least technically plausible. The barrels contained industrial alcohol, which can release volatile gases under heat or pressure. But if that were the case, why didn't they return once the danger passed? Natural disasters were another theory. A sudden waterspout, a rogue wave, or a rare seismic sea event could have forced the crew to evacuate in panic. Yet the Mary Celeste remained upright and largely undamaged. The lifeboat had simply vanished, along with everyone on board. There were no distress signals recorded by nearby ships. It was as though they had been erased from the sea. The longer the mystery lingered, the more the story grew. Newspapers in the 1870s treated the Mary Celeste like an open canvas for imagination. Some embellished details, describing half-eaten breakfasts on the table or warm cups of tea still steaming, none of which were ever part of the official reports. The image of a ghost ship drifting silently across the Atlantic became irresistible, a maritime legend that blurred fact and fiction. In the decades that followed, the Mary Celeste continued to sail under new captains, but her reputation darkened. Sailors considered her cursed. One owner deliberately sank her in an insurance scam years later, and she was left to rot off the coast of Haiti. The name that had once been ordinary became synonymous with mystery itself. A ship forever lost, even when found. Modern investigations, using maritime expertise and chemical analysis, have revisited the case many times. The alcohol vapor theory remains among the most accepted explanations. Scientists demonstrated that certain conditions could cause the buildup of gases capable of creating small explosions or even bursts of fire without leaving scorch marks. It's possible that Captain Briggs, fearing an imminent explosion, ordered everyone into the lifeboat while they ventilated the ship. But if the rope connecting the lifeboat to the Mary Celeste snapped in rough seas, they could have drifted away, watching helplessly as their ship, perfectly intact, faded into the horizon. It's a tragic and oddly poetic possibility. Not supernatural, not criminal, just human caution meeting bad luck. Still, even with all the logical reconstructions, something about the Mary Celeste refuses to settle into certainty. Maybe it's the silence of the ship when it was found, the eerie tidiness of daily life paused mid-motion, or the way the ocean seems to erase details yet preserve the outline of the story. The Mary Celeste endures not just because it's unexplained, but because it reflects the uneasy relationship between humans and the sea. How a crew can be there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind a ship that feels alive in its emptiness. When sailors found her, drifting aimlessly under the gray Atlantic sky, they must have felt something beyond fear, a quiet recognition that even in an age of maps and compasses, there are still places where certainty cannot follow. Over a century and a half later, the Mary Celeste remains one of maritime history's most haunting puzzles. Its name lives on as a symbol of the unknown, not a ghost story in the supernatural sense, but a reminder of how mystery lingers in ordinary things left unanswered. Perhaps that's why it's still told in whispers and documentaries and bedtime tales. A ship found adrift, sails flapping softly, no one aboard. The ocean keeping its secret calm and eternal. In 1976, the small town of Circleville, Ohio, became the center of a strange and unnerving mystery that would stretch across decades. Residents of the town were familiar with the quiet rhythms of rural life, the predictable routines of neighbors and families. But for one resident, the intrusion of anonymity, secrecy, and intimidation would turn daily life into a prolonged psychological ordeal. The case of the Circleville letters is not defined by violence alone, but by the persistent and invasive nature of fear delivered repeatedly through written words over nearly 20 years. At the center of the story was Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver and mother who lived in Circleville with her husband. In late 1976, Mary began receiving letters that were unsettling, accusatory, and highly personal. The letters detailed knowledge of her private life, making claims about her relationships and actions that were both invasive and threatening. Initially, she assumed the letters were the work of a prankster, perhaps a local resident with too much time and curiosity. But as the correspondence continued, the content became more aggressive, with warnings and intimations of consequences if she did not comply with the writer's instructions. The letters arrived in handwriting that was neat but unremarkable, yet the tone was unmistakable. The writer seemed obsessed, claiming to know intimate details about Mary's life and threatening exposure and public humiliation. One early letter warned her to end a particular relationship, despite there being no evidence of impropriety. Later letters escalated in hostility, accusing Mary of acts she had not committed, making threats against her safety, and even implying harm to her family. The effect was pervasive, as Mary and her husband began to live in a constant state of alertness and anxiety, unsure who in their community might be behind the notes. Police involvement began shortly after the letters arrived. Investigators examined handwriting, postmarks, and potential suspects within the local community. Yet the letters were sent in such a way as to obscure the sender's identity. Some were mailed from nearby towns, others from locations more distant, suggesting deliberate planning and an understanding of postal systems. Despite interviews with neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, authorities could identify no clear suspect. As the years passed, the letters continued. They became a fixture in the lives of Mary and her family, arriving sporadically yet consistently, with content that oscillated between accusation, revelation, and threat. The writer displayed a detailed knowledge of the family's routines, observing schedules and making references to private conversations. For residents in Circleville, the letters were a topic of whispered conversation, a local mystery that defied simple explanation and left the community unsettled. The case escalated in 1977 when Mary's husband, Paul Gillespie, was targeted directly. While driving along a local road, a device attached to a bridge appeared to be designed to strike his car. Though he survived without injury, the act suggested that the anonymous writer was willing to move beyond letters into physical intimidation. The connection between the letters and the attempted assault became a key point for investigators, emphasizing the seriousness of the threat and the calculated nature of the writer. One of the most notable aspects of the Circleville letters case is the persistence and longevity of the harassment. The letters continued intermittently for nearly 2 decades, creating a psychological toll that compounded over time. Mary and her family reported constant vigilance, anxiety over daily routines, and the stress of navigating a community in which anyone could be the sender. The letters frequently included instructions or demands, and the threat of exposure or harm created a climate in which everyday activities were laden with suspicion. In 1983, an individual named Paul Freshour, a local school bus driver and resident, was accused of sending the letters. The accusation stemmed from handwriting analysis, alleged behavioral patterns, and proximity to the recipients. Freshour was convicted and sentenced to prison. However, following his imprisonment, letters continued to arrive, suggesting that either the conviction was an error, that someone else was involved, or that the harassment had multiple sources. This continuation deepened the mystery and led to debates about whether the case could ever be conclusively resolved. The content of the letters remained disturbing throughout the series. They referenced personal relationships, claimed to know the inner thoughts of recipients, and threatened exposure of supposed wrongdoing. The writer demonstrated a capacity to monitor private life, sending letters that were tailored to events that had just occurred. In addition to Mary Gillespie, other residents of Circleville reportedly received letters or became indirectly involved, creating a ripple effect of suspicion, anxiety, and distrust throughout the community. The Circleville letters case stands out not because of murder or violent crime alone, but because of its sustained psychological impact. The repeated harassment, combined with an inability to identify a consistent or verifiable perpetrator, created an environment in which ordinary life was overshadowed by fear. It is a reminder that crime is not only physical, it can also be procedural, persistent, and invasive, altering the daily existence of those targeted in ways that are subtle but profound. Investigators explored numerous theories that the letters were the work of an obsessive ex-lover, a local individual with grudges against Mary and her family, or even multiple participants working in coordination. None of these theories produced definitive results. Handwriting analysis, while suggestive in some cases, could not conclusively attribute all letters to a single individual, and postal examinations revealed no pattern that would conclusively identify the sender. By the 1990s, the letters had largely stopped, leaving behind a sense of unresolved tension. The accused individual had served time, but questions remained. For Mary Gillespie and those who followed the case, the Circleville letters represent an example of how anonymity, knowledge of personal life, and psychological manipulation can be employed to exert control and fear. Unlike crimes with clear physical evidence or known perpetrators, this case remains a study in the vulnerability created by the unknown. Today, the Circleville letters continue to capture interest among true crime researchers and historians. The case is frequently cited in discussions of anonymous harassment, stalking, and the impact of sustained psychological intimidation. Its enduring intrigue lies in the combination of small-town life and extraordinary intrusion. A letter arriving in a mailbox, carrying knowledge, accusation, and threat, capable of upending the calm of a household, and leaving questions that endure long after the paper has been read and filed away. In imagining Circleville during those years, one can picture a town going about its daily routines. Children walking to school, neighbors tending gardens, local businesses opening their doors, all under the shadow of unseen observation. For Mary Gillespie, every mail delivery, every passerby, every movement in her immediate environment could carry meaning, threat, or implication. It is this blending of ordinary life with persistent, unexplained intrusion that defines the case, making it both unsettling and uniquely memorable. Ultimately, the Circleville letters remain unsolved in terms of comprehensive resolution. While one individual was convicted, the continuation of the letters suggests that answers remain partial and that the psychological weight of the case persists in memory. The story is a quiet kind of terror, less about immediate physical danger than about the erosion of trust and the intrusion of anonymity into personal space. It reminds us that crime can be subtle, long-lasting, and deeply invasive, leaving a lasting impression without dramatic confrontation, and that sometimes the most compelling mysteries are those that linger in the margins, carried on paper, waiting quietly to be understood. In the small town of Belen, New Mexico, life in the late 1980s moved at a measured pace, punctuated by school schedules, local events, and quiet routines. Yet in September 1988, a disappearance would shatter that sense of calm and leave a community grappling with a mystery that endures to this day. Tara Calico, a 19-year-old woman known for her independence and adventurous spirit, vanished without a trace while riding her bicycle along a rural stretch near her home. Tara's life was ordinary in many ways, yet marked by the youthful desire for freedom. She attended the University of New Mexico and spent her days balancing coursework, friends, and family. On the day of her disappearance, she had borrowed her mother's bicycle and set out along a familiar route near her neighborhood. This path, often traversed by local cyclists, offered a sense of security born of routine, the comfort of a route traveled countless times. Her disappearance, however, would be anything but ordinary. Despite searches by family, friends, and law enforcement, Tara was never seen again. The investigation began almost immediately, with officers canvassing the area, checking local roads, and questioning neighbors and passersby. Initial leads proved fruitless, leaving the community with an uneasy awareness that someone had simply vanished without explanation. The case took a disturbing turn in 1989, several months after Tara's disappearance, when a Polaroid photograph surfaced. The image, mailed to an unknown recipient in Florida, depicted a young woman and a boy, both bound and gagged, seated on what appeared to be a bed in an unknown location. The woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Tara, and the boy's identity has never been confirmed. Investigators analyzed the Polaroid extensively, considering lighting, decor, and other elements to determine whether the photograph was genuine. The photo was never conclusively authenticated, but it fueled public concern and speculation. Throughout the investigation, authorities explored numerous possibilities. Some suggested that Tara had been abducted by someone familiar with her routine, while others theorized that she may have encountered a stranger along the quiet road she often traveled. Investigators examined the bicycles, roadway conditions, and nearby residences for evidence, yet found little to connect a suspect to the disappearance. The rural landscape, while serene, offered ample concealment for someone with ill intent, and the passage of time quickly complicated the search for meaningful clues. Family members played a critical role in the investigation, raising awareness and appealing to the public for information. Tara's mother, Terry Calico, spoke openly about her daughter's character, emphasizing her adventurous nature, her independence, and her reliability. Friends recalled Tara's careful planning, her attentiveness to routine, and the improbability that she would simply disappear voluntarily. These personal details painted a picture of a young woman whose disappearance seemed inconsistent with her personality, heightening the mystery. Media coverage amplified both concern and curiosity. Local news stations and national outlets covered the story, examining the photograph and reporting on search efforts. Analysts debated the authenticity of the Polaroid, speculating on whether it depicted Tara or was a cruel hoax. The uncertainty surrounding the photograph added a layer of tension to an already perplexing case, blurring the line between hope and despair for those following the story. Law enforcement continued to pursue leads over the following years, revisiting evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and exploring tips from the public. Some investigators considered the possibility of organized abduction, while others examined the potential for a random encounter on a rural road. Despite advances in technology and investigative methods, Tara's disappearance remains unsolved. The absence of physical evidence, combined with the lack of witnesses, has left the case open and unresolved for decades. The psychological impact on the community cannot be overstated. Residents of Belen and surrounding areas were confronted with the reality that a young woman could vanish so completely, without warning or explanation. Parents became more cautious about their children's routines. Friends reevaluated the risks of independence, and the town itself was marked by the lingering tension of uncertainty. The story of Tara Calico became emblematic of the vulnerability inherent in seemingly ordinary circumstances, the hidden dangers that can exist even in familiar environments. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is the ambiguity surrounding the Polaroid photograph. Analysts examined details such as the bedding, background objects, and physical features of the individuals pictured, attempting to match them with Tara's known characteristics. While some experts argued in favor of authenticity, others noted inconsistencies that suggested the image could be unrelated. The uncertainty has contributed to decades of speculation, keeping the story alive in public consciousness and preserving the tension between hope and fear. The case also highlights broader issues related to missing persons investigations in rural areas. Limited witnesses, sparse surveillance, and extended response times can create conditions in which abductions or disappearances become exceptionally difficult to resolve. In Tara's case, the combination of rural isolation, the absence of immediate evidence, and the potential for a perpetrator with knowledge of the area all contributed to the enduring challenge of the investigation. Over the years, various theories have emerged. Some suggest that Tara may have been targeted by someone she knew, familiar with her schedule, and capable of predicting her route. Others propose that she encountered a stranger who seized an unexpected opportunity. Investigators have explored connections to similar disappearances in New Mexico and surrounding states, though no definitive links have been established. The multiplicity of possibilities underscores the complexity of understanding cases in which both victim and perpetrator remain obscured. Despite the passage of decades, Tara's family continues to advocate for answers. Her disappearance has inspired renewed interest as forensic methods and investigative technologies have advanced, providing hope that clues overlooked in the late 1980s might still yield results. Organizations focused on missing persons have preserved and circulated information, maintaining public awareness and emphasizing the importance of ongoing investigation. For those following the story, the disappearance of Tara Calico serves as a reminder of the fragility of routine life, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the enduring uncertainty that can accompany missing persons cases. It is a story defined by absence, by the impossibility of closure, and by the intersection of ordinary life with extraordinary and inexplicable events. In reflecting on Tara's story, one can imagine the quiet roads of Belen in the late summer of 1988, the sun slanting over open fields, and a young woman cycling along a familiar path. The disappearance, sudden and unexplainable, transformed those ordinary moments into a lasting tension that continues to resonate. It is a narrative of endurance, uncertainty, and the persistent human need to understand what cannot easily be explained. The case of Tara Calico remains open, a quiet and unresolved mystery. For investigators, family, and community members, it represents both the limitations of what can be known and the enduring desire for resolution. The photograph, the search, and the unanswered questions continue to draw attention, serving as a poignant reminder of how easily a life can vanish from view, leaving only speculation, memory, and hope in its wake. It was just after 1:20 in the morning on a quiet Sunday in Boston, March 18th, 1990. The streets were still, the air was cold, and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum stood motionless in the dark. Its Venetian courtyard and marble halls were asleep beneath the city's hum, and inside, only two night guards watched over the art collection. It was a routine shift, slow and uneventful. But in less than 2 hours, 13 pieces of art, together worth $500 million, would vanish, leaving behind one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in modern history. The museum had been Isabella Stewart Gardner's creation, a reflection of her vision and taste. She arranged every object herself, every sculpture and painting placed exactly as she wished. When she died, her will demanded that nothing in the museum ever be moved or rearranged. It was meant to stay, just as she left it, an artwork in itself. Decades later, her wish would be respected, even in absence, because when the thieves struck and the frames were found empty, the staff chose to leave them hanging that way, frozen reminders of what was taken. That night, the guards on duty were Rickabath and Randy Heston. Both were young, both accustomed to long, quiet hours wandering dim corridors filled with paintings by masters like Rembrandt and Vermeer. The alarms were armed, the museum secure, and outside, St. Patrick's Day celebrations were dying down. Somewhere between the noise of the city fading and the deep silence that followed, two men parked a small car near the museum's side entrance. They wore police uniforms, dark jackets, badges, and caps, and claimed to be responding to a disturbance. Around 1:24, they rang the buzzer. Rickabath, seeing them on the monitor, hesitated briefly. The uniforms looked real enough. When one of the men told him they were there because of reports of a break-in, he let them in. It was a decision that would haunt the investigation for decades. The moment they stepped inside, the men told Abath to move away from his post. Then they said, "Don't give us any trouble. This is a robbery." In seconds, they had handcuffed him. When Heston arrived, he was also subdued. Both guards were bound with duct tape and tied to pipes in the basement. They were left there for the rest of the night while the thieves roamed freely through the museum. Later, motion sensors would show the thieves' path through the galleries, room by room. They started in the Dutch room, home to some of the museum's most valuable works. They smashed the glass protecting Christ in the storm on the Sea of Galilee, Rembrandt's only known seascape, and sliced it out of its frame. They did the same with A Lady and Gentleman in Black, another Rembrandt, and took the concert by Vermeer, one of only 34 known Vermeers in the world. They added landscape with an obelisk by Govert Flinck, an artist often mistaken for Rembrandt, and a small Chinese bronze vessel, a beaker used in ancient rituals. In other rooms, they stole 5 drawings by Edgar Degas, each showing scenes of horses and riders, and they took Chez Tortoni, a small painting by Edouard Manet. They even removed a gilded bronze eagle finial that once adorned a Napoleonic flag. It was an odd selection, valuable but inconsistent. Many equally famous works were left untouched. Some believed the thieves had a list, or that they were stealing on commission. Others thought they simply grabbed what they could handle, pieces light enough to carry and easy to cut from frames. They stayed inside for about 81 minutes, far longer than most professional art thefts. They made several trips to their car, hauling canvas and bronze out into the cold. When they finally drove away, the museum fell silent again, its alarms useless, its guards restrained in darkness. It wasn't until the next morning that staff discovered what had happened. When the day shift arrived, they couldn't find the guards. They called the police, and soon officers were walking through the museum's galleries, confronted by rows of empty frames and pieces of broken glass. The scope of the theft was staggering. 13 works were gone, valued then at around $200 million, and now estimated at over $500 million. The FBI took over the case immediately. They interviewed staff, checked nearby surveillance cameras, and searched for the vehicle described by witnesses near the museum that night. But the investigation was messy from the start. The museum's own security system had recorded little useful footage, and there were no signs of forced entry. Suspicion naturally turned toward the guards, especially Rickabath, who had opened the door and violated procedure. He claimed he thought the men were real officers. Investigators found it strange that he had also opened a side door earlier that night for no apparent reason, perhaps to let the thieves test the alarm system or to signal them that it was safe. Still, no evidence ever tied him directly to the crime. Over the years, the investigation produced countless theories. Some pointed to local criminals with ties to organized crime in Boston. Others suggested the art was used as collateral in drug trades or hidden away by collectors. A few believed the paintings had been destroyed, burned, buried, or left to rot because they were impossible to sell. No theory was ever proven. Every so often, new information surfaces, but nothing ever leads to the missing art. The FBI has stated that both thieves likely died long ago, yet the search for the paintings continues. The Gardner Museum itself became part of the story. The staff decided not to replace the stolen works or even repair the damage. Instead, the empty frames still hang in the same spots they once occupied, exactly as Isabella Gardner's were required. Visitors see absence as much as art, spaces filled with history and loss. The museum offers a $10 million reward for information leading to recovery of the stolen pieces, but decades have passed with no success. Even the way the theft was carried out continues to puzzle experts. The thieves showed both clumsiness and precision. They broke glass and cut canvases crudely, damaging priceless works. Yet they knew exactly which rooms to target. They ignored the museum's most famous painting, Titian's The Rape of Europa, worth far more than the others combined. That odd mix of recklessness and planning fuels endless speculation. In 2015, the FBI released a video showing a man entering the museum the night before the heist through the same door the thieves later used. His identity remains unknown. Investigators believe the thieves may have cased the museum that night, testing the guards' reactions. But even that clue led nowhere. Today, the Gardner heist remains the largest unsolved art theft in history. None of the 13 pieces have been recovered, and no one has ever been charged. Theories continue to surface, some credible, others wild. Some claim the art was hidden in a storage unit somewhere in New England. Others think it's overseas, perhaps in private collections where it can never be shown. The museum's director once said that solving the case feels possible, but finding the paintings intact feels less so. Still, the Gardner refuses to give up hope. The museum's website maintains a detailed record of every missing work, with high-resolution images and background information. The FBI keeps the case active. Visitors continue to stand before the empty frames, the outlines of missing canvases visible against faded wall fabric. Those gaps have become as iconic as the paintings themselves. More than 30 years have passed since that night. The guards who were tied up are older, the investigators who began the case have retired, and many of the suspected criminals are dead. Yet the story endures, not for its violence or drama, but for its quiet mystery. Two men in fake uniforms walked into a museum and walked out with a fortune, leaving behind silence and confusion. They seem to disappear into thin air. Sometimes at night, the Gardner Museum is still as it was in 1990, dimly lit, echoing with footsteps, the same stillness, the same marble floors. The Dutch room feels heavy with memory. You can almost picture the thieves standing under Rembrandt's stormy seascape, cutting it from its frame, the fragments of glass glinting on the floor. And then you can imagine them gone, the painting folded or rolled, carried into the night air, never seen again. Maybe those works are still out there, hidden in a basement, wrapped in canvas and dust, waiting to be found. Maybe they've long since vanished. Either way, the story has become larger than the crime itself. A mystery about time, loss, and the fragile ways humans try to preserve beauty. And so the empty frames remain. They hang like open hands, holding nothing and everything at once. A reminder that even in absence, art can still move us. Somewhere, perhaps, The missing paintings still exist, quiet, forgotten, asleep in the dark. It was August 20th, 1966, when a young man wandering the hills of Niterói, Brazil, came across something he would never forget. He had been hiking through a place called Morro do Ventum, a scrub-covered slope overlooking the city, when he saw two figures lying in the grass. They were men, motionless, side by side, dressed in neat suits and wearing raincoats despite the heat. What drew attention first, though, was what covered their faces, smooth, metallic masks made of lead. The kind a person might wear to protect their eyes from radiation or bright light. They were lying back as if resting, hands on their chests, with nothing disturb around them. At first glance, it looked like they had simply lain down to sleep. But neither of them would wake again. The police were called. When investigators arrived, they found the two men exactly as described. Lying on their backs, side by side, their lead masks catching the dim sunlight. Near the bodies were a few curious items: an empty water bottle, a packet with 2 wet towels, and a small notebook. Inside that notebook was a single, puzzling note written in Portuguese. Translated, it read, 1630B at the determined place. 1830 swallow capsules. After effect protect metals. Await signal mask. That was all. No other details, no explanations. Nothing about what the signal was or what the capsules contained. There were no signs of struggle, no weapons, no injuries. Their faces were peaceful. Their clothes were in good condition, the buttons fastened, their shoes neatly placed. The area showed no footprints or evidence of anyone else having been there. The men were identified soon after as Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana, 2 electronics technicians from the nearby town of Campos dos Goitacazes, about 200 kilometers away. When police searched their homes and traced their last known movements, the story that unfolded became even stranger. Days earlier, they had told their families they were traveling to Sao Paulo to buy equipment for their work. They left together, carrying about enough money for travel and supplies, dressed formally as if on a business trip. Along the way, they bought the raincoats and the water bottle that would later be found beside them. They were last seen alive in Niterói on August 17th, 3 days before they were found. A waitress who served them remembered that one of the men looked nervous, checking his watch often. She said they seemed anxious but polite. When the autopsies were done, the results only deepened the mystery. Both men were healthy, with no obvious cause of death. There were no injuries, no burns, no marks. Their internal organs showed signs of congestion, consistent with poisoning, but toxicology tests were inconclusive. The forensic lab hadn't examined their organs quickly enough, and any chemicals that might have been present had already broken down. It's possible that whatever substance they swallowed was beyond the detection methods of the time. The case became known as the lead masks mystery, and it quickly spread through Brazilian newspapers. People were fascinated and unsettled. 2 intelligent, seemingly ordinary technicians lying dead on a hillside, with cryptic notes and strange metal masks. No reason, no known motive, no trace of struggle. It sounded like something from a surreal novel. Investigators looked into their background. Both men were skilled in radio electronics, and both shared a strong interest in spiritualism, a movement popular in mid-20th century Brazil. Friends told police that they had attended meetings where participants attempted to communicate with spirits or beings from other dimensions through light and sound. Some witnesses claimed the 2 men had been working on a kind of spiritual experiment, possibly using the masks to protect themselves from radiation during contact with an entity they believed existed beyond the physical world. The note seemed to fit this theory. The capsules could have been a sedative or hallucinogen meant to help them reach an altered state. This signal could have referred to some kind of light in the sky they were waiting for. Yet all of that was speculation. There was no proof, no witnesses to whatever had happened that night. Other theories emerged, each stranger than the last. Some said they were victims of a scam, that someone convinced them to ingest poison under the guise of spiritual ritual. Others suggested they might have been testing homemade radio transmitters or attempting to harness a new kind of energy something that accidentally killed them. And, inevitably, UFO theories appeared. The 1960s were a decade of fascination with space and the unknown, and the idea of two men dying while trying to contact extraterrestrials found an eager audience. Several locals reported seeing bright orange lights in the sky over Niteroi on the night of their deaths, which only deepened the myth. For police, the case had no clear direction. They found no suspects, no witnesses, and no solid evidence of foul play. The autopsy remained inconclusive. Without a clear toxic substance, they couldn't rule the deaths as homicide or suicide. The official report left the cause of death undetermined. In time, the media attention faded, and the case drifted into that quiet category of mysteries that never quite close. The hillside where they were found returned to silence. The raincoats, the empty bottle, and the lead mask were collected as evidence, but none offered further clues. The notebook, now worn and faint, remained the most haunting artifact, a final fragment of a plan that no one but the two men understood. Years later, people who revisited the case noticed odd details. The lead masks themselves were crudely handmade, as if cut and molded by hand, likely by the men themselves. The phrase "protect metals" in the note might have meant protect against radiation, suggesting they feared some harmful exposure. If they believed they were building or witnessing something with dangerous energy, electrical, magnetic, or even cosmic, the masks might have been their attempt at safety. In a way, it reflected their identities as technicians, men used to building devices and solving problems with tangible tools. But what was it that they expected to see? A light? A sound? A visitation? The fact that they went into the hills alone, carefully dressed at a precise time of day, with a note describing their steps, makes it feel deliberate, not random or impulsive. They were following instructions, whether their own or someone else's. The failure of that plan, whatever it was, ended quietly under the open sky. The mystery of the lead mass has endured not because it's terrifying, but because it's so quiet and so incomprehensible. Two men, bound by belief or curiosity, venturing out into the hills with the calm certainty of people who expect something extraordinary. There were no signs of panic, no violence. Just two lives that ended side by side, surrounded by silence, and the unfinished message of a note. Modern investigators have occasionally re-examined the files, though most of the evidence is gone or degraded. Technology could perhaps detect traces of what they ingested if samples had been preserved. But after nearly 60 years, the case remains one of Brazil's most unusual unsolved deaths. Some consider it a cautionary tale about obsession, others about faith and experiment, and some simply accept it as one of those human stories where reason falls short. Standing on Morro do Ventum today, it's easy to imagine the scene. The faint hum of the city below, the dry grass moving in the wind, the distant glow of streetlights. Two raincoats catching the last of the day's warmth. The metal masks glinting faintly. The quiet anticipation of something that never came. The notebook's final words echo in thought. Await signal mask. Maybe they saw it in some form beyond understanding. Maybe this signal wasn't in the sky, but in their own conviction. That moment where belief turns to certainty, even when no proof follows. The story of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viano has no ending that satisfies. The coroner could not explain their deaths. The police could not define a motive, and history could not decide what they were truly seeking. It remains one of those rare mysteries suspended in calm. Tragic, but not violent, strange, but not chaotic. A quiet puzzle from another time. And so the lead mask case endures, half legend, half science, all uncertainty. As you picture that hillside under the dim light of dusk, the two men at rest, the words of their final note almost whispered to the wind. Await signal mask. You can almost sense the calm they might have expected, the stillness before whatever they thought would begin. Perhaps that's what mystery really is, the silence that remains after questions fade, the feeling of something almost understood, just beyond reach. In October 2009, A remote area of rural Oklahoma became the center of one of the state's most perplexing and unsettling mysteries. The Jamison family, Bobby, Sherilyn, and their 8-year-old daughter Madison, vanished without explanation from their home near Red Oak, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions that continues to baffle authorities and the public alike. Bobby and Sherilyn Jamison were both in their 40s. Bobby worked as a truck driver and handyman, while Sherilyn managed the home and cared for Madison. Neighbors described the family as quiet, private, and somewhat reclusive, though friendly when approached. They lived on a small, rural property surrounded by woods and farmland, a place isolated enough that disturbances could go unnoticed for hours or even days. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, friends and family recalled nothing unusual. The Jamisons were known to have disputes with each other at times, but nothing that suggested imminent danger. They had a few disagreements over property and personal matters, typical of many households, but their daily routines seemed normal. Madison continued attending school, and both adults were active in work and home life. The last confirmed sightings of the family occurred on October 8, 2009. Sherilyn reportedly visited a local convenience store where she was seen buying groceries. Later that day, she and Bobby were observed in the vicinity of their home. After that, the Jamisons disappeared. Their trailer remained unlocked. Their dog, a German shepherd named Cash, was found chained outside, fed but anxious, and their vehicles were gone. Neighbors noticed lights on in the house, but received no response to knocks. Concern grew rapidly. Initially, authorities considered the possibility that the family had left voluntarily, perhaps for a trip or to escape personal difficulties. But no one could account for their whereabouts, and phone records indicated no calls or messages. By mid-October, the case had drawn attention from local news and law enforcement, and a search of the surrounding area began. The property was scoured, nearby fields checked, and residents interviewed. Despite extensive searches, there was no evidence of where the Jamisons had gone. In the months that followed, several discoveries deepened the mystery. Bobby's truck and Sherilyn's car were found abandoned near a dirt road, miles from their home. Both vehicles were intact, with personal items inside. Some suggested they might have gotten lost or been forced to stop, but the circumstances offered few clues. Inside the trailer, investigators found the family's belongings undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no apparent motive for kidnapping were evident. The dog remained, which some argued suggested the family had not left voluntarily. Normally, the dog would have followed them or escaped. The terrain around Red Oak complicated the investigation. Thick woods, creeks, and rough terrain made searching difficult. Volunteer search parties, along with law enforcement, spent weeks combing the area, often in harsh weather, but found little beyond tracks and scattered personal items. In 2013, for years after their disappearance, human remains were discovered in a heavily wooded area near where the cars had been found. Authorities later confirmed that these were the remains of the Jamison family. The condition of the remains suggested exposure to the elements and possibly animal activity over an extended period, though the exact circumstances of their deaths were impossible to determine. Speculation surrounding the case has been extensive. Some theorized foul play connected to drug activity or disputes with neighbors, though no evidence directly supported this. Others considered that the family might have been caught in an accident, lost in the woods, or faced an environmental hazard. The lack of trauma on the trailer and vehicles suggested that they left home for a reason, yet no explanation accounted for the abandonment of personal possessions or the dog. In addition to the physical mystery, the Jamison case is marked by reports of unexplained phenomena. Local residents have claimed sightings of strange lights in the area during the period surrounding the disappearance. Some described unusual sounds at night or a sense of being watched in the forest near the property. While no of these claims provide conclusive evidence, they contribute to the atmosphere of unease surrounding the case, reinforcing its reputation as one of Oklahoma's most haunting mysteries. Law enforcement and family members have continued to seek answers. Sherilyn's mother, in particular, has remained vocal, expressing frustration over the lack of resolution and clarity. Investigators have reviewed digital records, financial transactions, and communications, but no definitive motive or explanation has emerged. The Jamison's disappearance and deaths remain classified as suspicious, with no criminal charges filed due to the inability to establish a clear perpetrator or cause. What makes the Jamison case so haunting is the combination of disappearance and delay. For nearly 4 years, the family's absence was a question mark. Neighbors, friends, and authorities speculated on every possibility: voluntary disappearance, abduction, accident, foul play. When remains were eventually found, they confirmed the worst, yet provided few answers. The timeline of events, the behavior of the family, and the discovery of their vehicles leave a story that is disjointed, unsettling, and resistant to explanation. Unlike many true crime stories, the Jamison case offers no confession, no eyewitness account, no resolution. The mystery is compounded by isolation, a family lost in a wooded area, with few witnesses and no surveillance beyond occasional neighbor sightings. It is a story that exists in fragments: a grocery run, a dog chained outside, abandoned cars, a trailer full of belongings, and finally, the skeletal remains that tell us only that the family is gone. For those who follow the case, there is a lingering sense of absence, a reminder of the limits of knowledge, the way the environment can swallow events whole, and the vulnerability of individuals in isolated areas. It is not a story of heroism or villainy, but of disappearance, exposure, and the quiet persistence of mystery. The Jamisons' last movements remain unknowable, their final moments hidden in the woods, recorded only in the traces they left behind. Even today, Red Oak is quiet. The forests, roads, and fields hold the memory of the family, as much in what is missing as in what remains. For anyone visiting the area, there's a sense of stillness, of a past frozen in uncertainty. The Jamison family vanished from life, leaving behind questions that endure, unanswerable and lingering, as if the forest itself had absorbed the story and kept it close. On October 3rd, 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessup disappeared from her home in Queensville, Ontario, a quiet rural community north of Toronto. What began as a simple case of a missing child quickly evolved into one of Canada's most controversial and heartbreaking criminal investigations, one marked by a wrongful conviction, years of uncertainty, and finally, decades later, the truth. Christine was described as an outgoing, cheerful girl who loved animals, baseball, and spending time with her family. That afternoon, she had returned home from school to an empty house. Her mother, Janet, was visiting her husband, Bob, who was in prison for a minor fraud conviction. Christine planned to meet a friend later in the day to play, but when her mother returned that evening, the house was quiet. Christine was gone. Her bike, normally left outside, remained untouched. At first, it seemed possible she had gone to visit a neighbor or a friend, but as the hours passed and night fell, concern turned into alarm. A missing person report was filed. Police and volunteers began searching immediately. The community rallied, combing through fields, creeks, and wooded areas. Flyers were distributed, and roadblocks were set up along nearby highways. Despite the widespread effort, there were no signs of Christine. Her disappearance drew national attention, with local news covering every development. For her family, the days that followed were a blur of interviews, searches, and hope. Hope that she had simply wandered off and would soon be found safe. That hope ended 3 months later. On December 31st, 1984, Christine's body was discovered in a wooded area near Sunderland, about 50 kilometers from her home. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. The discovery shocked the small community and devastated her family. For investigators, the focus now shifted from search to homicide. The brutality of the crime suggested that the killer was someone capable of careful planning and concealment. Detectives collected forensic samples and began interviewing everyone connected to the Jessup family, including neighbors, friends, and relatives. Among those interviewed was a 25-year-old man named Guy Paul Morin, who lived next door to the Jessups. Morin was quiet, reserved, and somewhat eccentric, an amateur musician and beekeeper who largely kept to himself. In the days following the discovery of Christine's body, his behavior drew the attention of both investigators and neighbors, though there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Still, in the absence of stronger leads, suspicion gradually centered on him. In 1985, police obtained a search warrant for his home, seizing items they believed could be connected to the murder. That same year, Morin was arrested and charged with the abduction and murder of Christine Jessup. The case against him rested on a combination of circumstantial evidence and forensic claims. Investigators presented hair and fiber evidence they said matched items from the Jessup home and crime scene. Prosecutors argued that Morin's personality fit their psychological profile of the killer: solitary, introverted, and unusual. At trial in 1986, the jury was influenced by these portrayals. Morin was convicted of first-degree murder, but almost immediately, doubts began to emerge. Independent analysts questioned the reliability of the fiber evidence and the methods used by forensic examiners. Witness accounts were inconsistent, and there was no physical evidence conclusively placing Morin at the scene. In 1987, an appeals court overturned his conviction and ordered a new trial. 3 years later, in 1992, Morin was retried, and this time he was acquitted. Even so, the ordeal was far from over. Morin's name had been tied to one of the most publicized murders in Canadian history. The damage to his reputation was immense. Yet in 1995, DNA testing, a relatively new tool at the time, finally proved what he had maintained all along. He was innocent. The genetic profile found on Christine's underwear did not match Morin's DNA. He was officially exonerated. The Ontario government later issued a public apology and awarded him compensation for the years he lost to wrongful accusation. The revelation reignited the central question: if not Morin, then who had killed Christine Jessup? For nearly 3 decades, that question went unanswered. The case remained open but stagnant, with the physical evidence preserved in the hope that future advances in forensic technology might offer new clues. Meanwhile, Christine's family continued to live with the uncertainty. Her mother, Janet, spoke periodically to the media, emphasizing that justice for her daughter meant finding the real perpetrator, not just clearing an innocent man's name. In 2017, the Toronto Police Service's Cold Case Unit began re-examining evidence from the Jessup investigation using the latest DNA technology. Samples were retested, and the unknown male profile was uploaded into genetic genealogy databases. Like in the Golden State Killer case in the United States, investigators used the emerging field of genetic genealogy to trace potential relatives of the unknown offender. The process required careful analysis of family trees, historical records, and generational links. It was a slow and methodical process, but in 2020, it produced a breakthrough. That year, investigators announced that the man responsible for Christine Jessup's murder had finally been identified: Calvin Hoover, a man who had been an acquaintance of the Jessup family in 1984. He had attended social gatherings with Christine's parents and was known to them casually. At the time of the murder, Hoover lived in the same general area. His DNA matched the genetic material found on Christine's clothing. The match was conclusive. However, the discovery brought both closure and sorrow. Hoover had died by suicide in 2015, 5 years before the identification. He would never face trial or explain his actions. For Christine's family, the confirmation provided answers, but also reopened painful memories. Her mother said in a statement that she was grateful for the resolution, though no conclusion could ever undo the loss. Investigators echoed that sentiment, calling the outcome a bittersweet victory. Justice achieved too late for accountability. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin remains one of the most significant miscarriages of justice in Canadian history. It led to major reforms in the way forensic evidence is handled and how police investigations are conducted. The subsequent public inquiry, known as the Kaufman Inquiry, exposed systemic flaws in investigative practices, including tunnel vision over-reliance on forensic interpretations, and confirmation bias. It called for changes in training, evidence review, and oversight, reforms that continue to influence policing and forensic science in Canada today. As of today, the murder of Christine Jessup is officially closed. The answers came late, but they came. The identification of her killer does not erase the years of pain endured by those involved, but it restores a measure of truth. For many Canadians, the case stands as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of eventual justice, one that warns of the consequences of haste and bias, but also highlights the enduring pursuit of truth. Between 1918 and 1919, the city of New Orleans was gripped by a series of violent and mysterious attacks that would come to define one of the most unsettling chapters in the city's history. The perpetrator came to be known as the Axeman of New Orleans, a figure whose identity was never discovered, yet whose crimes left a city on edge and a culture forever marked by fear and speculation. The first known attack occurred on the night of May 23, 1918, in a small home on Felicity Street. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, a Sicilian-American couple, were asleep when an intruder entered their home through the back door. Using a straight razor and an axe he found in their house, the assailant attacked the sleeping couple. Catherine was killed. Joseph survived, though with severe injuries. The intruder had not ransacked the home, nor had he taken any valuables. The motive was unclear, and the brutality seemingly random. Over the following months, the attacks continued. Typically, the victims were Italian immigrants or members of the working-class community, though this was not universal. The assailants seemed to enter homes with ease, often while the residents slept, and used whatever weapons were available, most commonly axes or hatchets found within the house. The lack of consistent motive, combined with the seemingly arbitrary choice of victims, made the attacks particularly alarming. The city's police force, already under strain due to the aftermath of World War I and the influenza pandemic, struggled to contain the panic. Newspapers covered the story extensively, reporting every new incident in detail. The public was advised to lock doors and keep watch through the night, though many doubted that even vigilance could prevent the next attack. Families slept in groups, keeping lights on and weapons close at hand. As the months passed, the axeman's methods remained erratic. He often entered through unlocked doors, but sometimes forced entry. He avoided leaving fingerprints, footprints, or other forensic evidence, which at the time was difficult to gather anyway. In some cases, he left notes. One particularly famous note, published in the New Orleans Times-Picayune, was addressed to the city itself. In it, the writer claimed to be the axeman and stated that he would spare anyone who played jazz music in their homes on a particular night. The letter read as a mixture of threat and dark humor, specifying that those who refused to play music would meet a violent end. The letter created a citywide response. On March 13, 1919, nearly every home in New Orleans reportedly played jazz from midnight until dawn. Street musicians performed on corners. Families sang from windows. Pianos and fiddles echoed through neighborhoods. According to reports, no murders occurred that night, though some historians debate the accuracy of this detail. Regardless, the story contributed to the myth of the axeman, intertwining the crimes with the culture of the city, its music, and its Italian-American communities. Over time, a pattern emerged. The attacks generally targeted families of Italian descent, though not exclusively. They occurred at night, usually in homes with little to no security. The weapons were rarely brought in from outside, indicating that the assailant had access to the home's own tools and a knowledge of the interiors. No motive was ever definitively established. Police considered robbery, revenge, personal vendettas, and even insanity, but nothing fit consistently. The randomness, combined with the media coverage, amplified fear and speculation. Despite extensive investigation, the axeman was never caught. Various suspects were arrested over the years, ranging from local laborers to Italian immigrants with past criminal records, but none could be conclusively linked to the attacks. The city attempted increased policing, neighborhood watches, and community meetings, yet the assaults continued until around October 1919, when they abruptly stopped. No one knows why the attacks ceased. Theories suggest the killer may have moved away, been arrested for unrelated crimes, died, or simply lost interest. In the decades since, the Axeman of New Orleans has become part of American folklore. He represents a particular kind of urban fear, the idea that danger can enter the most private and secure spaces without warning. Yet, unlike many serial killers, the Axeman is remembered as much for the social reaction to his crimes as for the crimes themselves. The jazz letter, in particular, stands out as a cultural moment, linking terror with music in a uniquely New Orleans fashion. Historians have noted that the Axeman case reflects larger societal tensions of the period. The Italian immigrant community faced discrimination and scrutiny, which shaped public perception of the crimes. Newspaper accounts often emphasized the ethnicity of the victims, and some residents suspected mob involvement or inter-family feuds. Others interpreted the attacks as inexplicable violence, a reminder that fear can grow from randomness itself. Today, the Axeman is remembered not for resolution, but for the mood he imposed on a city, a blend of anxiety, superstition, and resilience. Musicians continue to play the jazz that once, according to legend, saved lives. Residents and visitors alike tell the story as part of the history of New Orleans, a narrative that combines the real horrors of violent crime with the city's enduring spirit and cultural identity. The legend of the Axeman endures because it sits at the intersection of fact and myth. We know the victims, the dates, the letters, and the attacks. We know that 5 people, perhaps more, were murdered and that countless others lived in fear. But we do not know the identity of the killer. He is, in that sense, an enigma, a shadow moving through the streets of a city that refuses to forget him, leaving behind only stories, music, and unanswered questions. In imagining the Axeman's presence, one can picture the quiet nights of New Orleans, the narrow streets lined with clapboard homes, the sound of wind rustling through the eaves. A figure moves silently from house to house, unseen and unknown, while inside families listen to the creaking floors, wondering if this night will be different. It is a tension without resolution, a story without closure, yet it persists, compelling attention even in the calm of reflection. The case reminds us that fear is not only born from certainty, but from uncertainty. The sense that an event could occur anywhere, at any time, and that normal life can be disrupted by an invisible force. In the Axeman's crimes, the ordinary became unpredictable, and the ordinary response, turning up lights, playing music, watching over one another, became both protective and ritualistic. In this way, the story is less about the killer and more about human behavior in the face of inexplicable danger. Though over a century has passed, the Axeman of New Orleans remains unsolved. No confession, no capture, no revelation has changed that. Yet the story continues to fascinate. The letters, the random attacks, the cultural interplay of fear and music, and the lasting imprint on the city. The Axeman is not just a historical figure. He is a symbol of a certain kind of quiet menace, one that can enter the home, disrupt life, and vanish without a trace, leaving a city to adjust, endure, and remember. In December 1956, the city of Chicago, Illinois, was gripped by winter's early chill. Snow had begun to accumulate along the streets, and residents navigated the familiar rhythms of a city bustling with commerce, school, and community life. Yet amid this ordinary backdrop, a disappearance occurred that would haunt the city for decades. Barbara and Patricia Grimes, aged 15 and 13, left their home one evening to attend a local concert and never returned. The sisters were known for their close bond, shared interests, and participation in school and neighborhood activities. Barbara, the elder, was thoughtful and protective, while Patricia possessed a bright curiosity and eagerness to explore. Their mother, a widow, had relied on the girls' maturity and independence, trusting them to follow routines responsibly. On the evening of December 28, 1956, they departed their home with friends to attend the concert, expecting to return safely by nightfall. When the girls failed to return, concern quickly escalated. Their mother contacted local authorities, prompting an immediate response from the Chicago Police Department. Officers canvassed the area, questioned neighbors, and retraced the sisters' steps along their anticipated route. Initial searches revealed no trace of the girls, intensifying fear and confusion within both the family and the surrounding community. As the investigation unfolded, authorities explored multiple avenues. One early theory suggested that the girls had run away, though their close ties to family and school made this unlikely. Another considered the possibility of abduction by an individual familiar with the neighborhood, capable of exploiting routine patterns to isolate the victims. The lack of witnesses and physical evidence complicated efforts to identify suspects or reconstruct the sequence of events leading to the girls' disappearance. Days later, the bodies of Barbara and Patricia were discovered in a remote area north of the city. They had been strangled, and signs of physical restraint suggested that the perpetrator had acted with premeditation. The brutality of the crime shocked the community, highlighting the vulnerability of even the most ordinary routines. Law enforcement faced an urgent need to identify the individual responsible while contending with the limitations of investigative methods in the 1950s, which lacked many modern forensic tools. Investigators questioned hundreds of potential witnesses, including friends, family, and acquaintances of the sisters. They examined known criminals in the area, cross-referenced recent arrests, and followed leads that ranged from seemingly credible to purely speculative. Despite exhaustive efforts, no suspect could be definitively linked to the crime, and the case gradually became a persistent enigma, emblematic of the challenges inherent in mid-20th century homicide investigations. The circumstances surrounding the murders fueled widespread speculation. Some theorists suggested that the sisters had inadvertently encountered someone with violent intentions while walking home. Others proposed that a predatory individual had been observing the family, learning their routines, and striking at an opportune moment. The combination of randomness and apparent planning created a tension between understanding motive and accepting the possibility of an incomprehensible act. Media coverage amplified the case's impact, portraying the tragedy in stark and human terms. Newspapers detailed the sisters' lives, the search efforts, and the ongoing investigation. Photographs of the girls appeared in both local and national publications, fostering public engagement and concern. Community members organized searches, while ordinary citizens expressed a heightened awareness of potential dangers in urban environments, particularly for children and teenagers navigating streets independently. The Grimes sisters case illustrates broader themes in criminal investigation. It highlights the vulnerability of routine, the challenge of identifying perpetrators in densely populated areas, and the limitations of investigative technology at the time. Fingerprinting, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence were relied upon heavily. Yet without modern DNA analysis or forensic profiling, investigators struggled to narrow potential suspects. The case remains a cautionary example of how ordinary life can intersect with extraordinary violence, leaving enduring questions about opportunity, motive, and human behavior. Over the years, various theories have persisted. Some suggest that the perpetrator may have been a transient individual with knowledge of the area. Others consider the possibility of a neighbor or acquaintance exploiting familiarity to commit the crime. Each hypothesis reflects an effort to reconcile the randomness of the act with the meticulousness apparent in the method of murder. The inability to confirm any single theory adds to the case's enduring intrigue and unease. For the families and the community, the murder of Barbara and Patricia Grimes represented a profound loss and a lingering challenge. The sisters were more than victims. They were individuals whose lives reflected ordinary joys, relationships, and routines. Their sudden and violent deaths created a void that extended beyond the immediate family, affecting friends, neighbors, and the broader city. The emotional impact, coupled with the unresolved nature of the crime, underscores the long-term consequences of violent acts on communities and collective memory. In reflecting on the Grimes sisters' case, one can imagine the streets of Chicago on that winter evening, quiet neighborhoods illuminated by streetlights, and the girls walking together with youthful confidence. The ordinary rhythms of life were disrupted in a moment of inexplicable violence, leaving behind a legacy of grief, unanswered questions, and investigative challenge. It is a story defined by absence, by the limits of understanding, and by the human desire for resolution in the face of incomprehensible acts. Modern investigators and true crime historians continue to examine the case. Archival records, witness statements, and crime scene reports are reviewed in light of contemporary analytical methods. While new forensic technologies have advanced significantly, the passage of time, loss of witnesses, and gaps in initial documentation present obstacles that have yet to be overcome. The enduring status of the case as unsolved keeps public interest alive, emphasizing both the historical and psychological dimensions of violent crime. The Grimes sisters' murders are remembered not only for the crime itself, but for their broader implications. They illustrate how everyday routines can expose vulnerability, how investigative limitations affect outcomes, and how communities respond to tragedy. The case highlights the importance of vigilance, awareness, and systematic investigation, while acknowledging that even thorough efforts may not always yield closure. Ultimately, the murder of Barbara and Patricia Grimes remains unsolved, a quiet and persistent mystery. For investigators, historians, and the public, it represents both the challenge of comprehending violent acts and the enduring human need for understanding. The sisters' lives, abruptly and violently ended, continue to resonate through memory, reflection, and the ongoing search for answers. Between 1918 and 1919, the city of New Orleans was gripped by a series of violent and mysterious attacks that would come to define one of the most unsettling chapters in the city's history. The perpetrator came to be known as the Axeman of New Orleans, a figure whose identity was never discovered, yet whose crimes left a city on edge and a culture forever marked by fear and speculation. The first known attack occurred on the night of May 23, 1918, in a small home on Felicity Street. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, a Sicilian-American couple, were asleep when an intruder entered their home through the back door. Using a straight razor and an axe he found in their house, the assailant attacked the sleeping couple. Catherine was killed. Joseph survived, though with severe injuries. The intruder had not ransacked the home, nor had he taken any valuables. The motive was unclear, and the brutality seemingly random. Over the following months, the attacks continued. Typically, the victims were Italian immigrants or members of the working-class community, though this was not universal. The assailants seemed to enter homes with ease, often while the residents slept, and used whatever weapons were available, most commonly axes or hatchets found within the house. The lack of consistent motive, combined with the seemingly arbitrary choice of victims, made the attacks particularly alarming. The city's police force, already under strain due to the aftermath of World War I and the influenza pandemic, struggled to contain the panic. Newspapers covered the story extensively, reporting every new incident in detail. The public was advised to lock doors and keep watch through the night, though many doubted that even vigilance could prevent the next attack. Families slept in groups, keeping lights on and weapons close at hand. As the months passed, the axeman's methods remained erratic. He often entered through unlocked doors, but sometimes forced entry. He avoided leaving fingerprints, footprints, or other forensic evidence, which at the time was difficult to gather anyway. In some cases, he left notes. One particularly famous note, published in the New Orleans Times-Picayune, was addressed to the city itself. In it, the writer claimed to be the axeman and stated that he would spare anyone who played jazz music in their homes on a particular night. The letter read as a mixture of threat and dark humor, specifying that those who refused to play music would meet a violent end. The letter created a citywide response. On March 13, 1919, nearly every home in New Orleans reportedly played jazz from midnight until dawn. Street musicians performed on corners. Families sang from windows. Pianos and fiddles echoed through neighborhoods. According to reports, no murders occurred that night, though some historians debate the accuracy of this detail. Regardless, the story contributed to the myth of the Axeman, intertwining the crimes with the culture of the city, its music, and its Italian-American communities. Over time, a pattern emerged. The attacks generally targeted families of Italian descent, though not exclusively. They occurred at night, usually in homes with little to no security. The weapons were rarely brought in from outside, indicating that the assailant had access to the home's own tools and a knowledge of the interiors. No motive was ever definitively established. Police considered robbery, revenge, personal vendettas, and even insanity, but nothing fit consistently. The randomness, combined with the media coverage, amplified fear and speculation. Despite extensive investigation, the Axeman was never caught. Various suspects were arrested over the years, ranging from local laborers to Italian immigrants with past criminal records, but none could be conclusively linked to the attacks. The city attempted increased policing, neighborhood watches, and community meetings, yet the assaults continued until around October 1919, when they abruptly stopped. No one knows why the attacks ceased. Theories suggest the killer may have moved away, been arrested for unrelated crimes, died, or simply lost interest. In the decades since, the Axeman of New Orleans has become part of American folklore. He represents a particular kind of urban fear, the idea that danger can enter the most private and secure spaces without warning. Yet, unlike many serial killers, the Axeman is remembered as much for the social reaction to his crimes as for the crimes themselves. The Jazz Letter, in particular, stands out as a cultural moment, linking terror with music in a uniquely New Orleans fashion. Historians have noted that the Axeman case reflects larger societal tensions of the period. The Italian immigrant community faced discrimination and scrutiny, which shaped public perception of the crimes. Newspaper accounts often emphasized the ethnicity of the victims, and some residents suspected mob involvement or inter-family feuds. Others interpreted the attacks as inexplicable violence, a reminder that fear can grow from randomness itself. Today, the Axeman is remembered not for resolution, but for the mood he imposed on a city, a blend of anxiety, superstition, and resilience. Musicians continue to play the jazz that once, according to legend, saved lives. Residents and visitors alike tell the story as part of the history of New Orleans, a narrative that combines the real horrors of violent crime with the city's enduring spirit and cultural identity. The legend of the Axeman endures because it sits at the intersection of fact and myth. We know the victims, the dates, the letters, and the attacks. We know that 5 people, perhaps more, were murdered and that countless others lived in fear. But we do not know the identity of the killer. He is, in that sense, an enigma, a shadow moving through the streets of a city that refuses to forget him, leaving behind only stories, music, and unanswered questions. In imagining the Axeman's presence, one can picture the quiet nights of New Orleans, the narrow streets lined with clapboard homes, the sound of wind rustling through the eaves. A figure moves silently from house to house, unseen and unknown, while inside families listen to the creaking floors, wondering if this night will be different. It is a tension without resolution, a story without closure, yet it persists, compelling attention even in the calm of reflection. The case reminds us that fear is not only born from certainty, but from uncertainty, the sense that an event could occur anywhere, at any time, and that normal life can be disrupted by an invisible force. In the Axeman's crimes, the ordinary became unpredictable, and the ordinary response, turning up lights, playing music, watching over one another, became both protective and ritualistic. In this way, the story is less about the killer and more about human behavior in the face of inexplicable danger. Though over a century has passed, the Axeman of New Orleans remains unsolved. No confession, no capture, no revelation has changed that. Yet the story continues to fascinate. the letters, the random attacks, the cultural interplay of fear and music, and a lasting imprint on the city. The Axeman is not just a historical figure. He is a symbol of a certain kind of quiet menace, one that can enter the home, disrupt life, and vanish without a trace, leaving a city to adjust, endure, and remember. In the late 1960s, Northern California was a place of cultural transformation. The counterculture movement was in full swing. Music and art flourished, and communities were experimenting with new ways of living. Yet amid this backdrop of social change, a series of violent crimes began to unsettle the region. An unknown assailant, later identified in the public imagination as the Zodiac Killer, committed a string of murders that would both horrify and fascinate the nation, leaving an enduring mystery that remains unresolved to this day. The Zodiac Killer is believed to have begun his attacks in 1968, targeting young couples in secluded areas. These victims were often alone, situated in environments that offered both privacy and vulnerability. The killings were characterized by sudden, brutal violence, typically involving shooting or stabbing, and the perpetrator demonstrated a chilling ability to evade capture. His crimes were marked not only by their lethality, but by the meticulous manner in which he taunted both investigators and the public. What distinguished the Zodiac Killer from many contemporaneous criminals was his use of communication as part of the crime. He sent letters to newspapers, often accompanied by cryptic ciphers and symbols, in which he claimed responsibility for the murders and threatened future attacks. These communications were designed to provoke fear, demonstrate control, and challenge law enforcement. Some letters contained encrypted messages, which remain only partially solved, while others included specific references that suggested a personal involvement in the crimes. The interplay of action and communication created a complex psychological profile, one that suggested a perpetrator both methodical and compulsive. Investigators faced immense challenges in understanding and capturing the Zodiac. The killings were dispersed across multiple counties, often occurring in remote or semi-rural locations. The perpetrator's ability to move between jurisdictions complicated law enforcement efforts, as local police departments had limited coordination and access to centralized resources. The lack of eyewitnesses, combined with the randomness of the attacks, made establishing patterns and predicting behavior exceptionally difficult. The victims themselves were ordinary individuals whose lives intersected with danger by chance or circumstance. Young couples sought privacy and leisure in quiet locations, unaware of the presence of a predator. Their deaths left families in shock, communities fearful, and law enforcement scrambling for leads. In some cases, survivors provided critical eyewitness testimony, describing attackers' appearances, behavior, or vehicles, yet these accounts were often incomplete or inconsistent, reflecting the high-stress conditions under which they were given. Public fascination with the Zodiac case was amplified by media coverage. Newspapers reported on letters, ciphers, and the escalating body count, emphasizing the mystery and terror associated with the attacks. The anonymity of the killer, combined with the audacity of communicating directly with the press, created a climate in which fear and intrigue were intertwined. The Zodiac became both a subject of investigative focus and a cultural phenomenon, inspiring books, documentaries, and fictionalized interpretations that continue to captivate audiences decades later. Despite extensive investigation, no definitive suspect has ever been identified. Authorities examined hundreds of individuals, from local residents to transit workers, considering motives, opportunity, and behavioral patterns. Forensic evidence was limited, and while handwriting analysis, fingerprinting, and other methods were employed, the technology of the era constrained investigators' ability to link potential suspects to the crimes conclusively. The passage of time has only compounded the difficulty of solving the case, though modern forensic techniques, including DNA analysis, have prompted renewed interest in revisiting evidence. The Zodiac Killer ciphers represent one of the most compelling elements of the case. Several encrypted messages were sent to newspapers, challenging both the public and law enforcement to decipher them. Some were solved, revealing threatening or boastful content, while others remain unbroken, offering tantalizing glimpses into the mind of the perpetrator. These communications suggest a level of intelligence, patience, and obsession, as well as a desire for recognition and control that extended beyond the immediate act of murder. For the communities affected, the Zodiac's crimes fostered a pervasive sense of unease. Parents, students, and residents navigated daily routines with heightened vigilance, aware that a seemingly ordinary drive or walk could intersect with danger. The psychological impact of the case extended beyond the immediate victims, influencing social behavior, patterns of travel, and perceptions of safety. The randomness of the attacks created a persistent tension, as no individual or location could be considered entirely secure. The case also illustrates the limitations of law enforcement coordination during the period. Multiple jurisdictions, varying investigative techniques, and differing interpretations of evidence hindered efforts to capture the killer. Despite these challenges, authorities remained committed to solving the case, organizing task forces, sharing information, and examining potential suspects through both forensic and behavioral analysis. The absence of resolution, however, underscores the enduring difficulty of apprehending a perpetrator who operates with patience, intelligence, and knowledge of investigative methods. Over the decades, numerous theories and suspects have emerged. Some suggest the killer was an ordinary individual living among the communities he terrorized, blending into the fabric of daily life while committing extreme violence in secret. Others propose that he possessed specialized knowledge or psychological tendencies that enabled him to plan and execute murders while evading capture. Each theory reflects an effort to reconcile the unpredictability of the attacks with the careful planning evident in both the murders and the accompanying communications. The Zodiac case also holds significance for the study of criminal psychology. The combination of lethality, attention-seeking behavior, and strategic communication provides insight into the mindset of a serial offender. Analysts have examined patterns of victim selection, geographical dispersion, and message content to understand the motivations and behavioral tendencies of the perpetrator. While the case remains unsolved, these analyses contribute to broader understanding of serial crime dynamics and investigative methodology. For the victims' families, the Zodiac killer represents both loss and unresolved trauma. The absence of closure has left enduring questions, compounded by the passage of time and the persistent anonymity of the perpetrator. Public fascination, while often framed as curiosity or true crime interest, intersects with real human grief, illustrating the complex interplay between societal attention and personal tragedy. Despite the decades that have passed since the first attacks, the Zodiac killer continues to evoke both fear and fascination. Investigators, historians, and amateur sleuths examine the case, revisiting letters, analyzing evidence, and exploring potential connections to unsolved crimes. Advances in technology, particularly in forensic science, offer the possibility of new breakthroughs, though the challenges of time, lost evidence, and limited eyewitness accounts persist. Reflecting on the Zodiac killer's story, one can imagine the Northern California landscape in the late 1960s. Quiet rural roads shadowed by trees, couples seeking solitude, ordinary lives intersecting with extraordinary danger. The tension between routine life and sudden violence is central to the narrative, illustrating how calculated criminal behavior can disrupt communities and linger in collective memory. Ultimately, the Zodiac killer case remains unsolved, a quiet and persistent enigma. It embodies the unpredictability of human behavior, the challenges of law enforcement, and the enduring fascination of unresolved crime. For those who study the case, it provides both lessons and mysteries, highlighting the interplay between opportunity, planning, and human psychology. The story is defined by absence, by unanswered questions, and by the haunting reality of a perpetrator who may never be identified. The narrative of the Zodiac killer endures not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the broader implications for understanding danger, anonymity, and the persistence of unresolved mystery. Communities affected, investigators and those drawn to true crime are reminded of both the fragility of safety and the enduring complexity of human behavior. In the quiet moments, the story remains a reminder of uncertainty, vulnerability, and the enduring human desire to understand what defies explanation. In the early days of March 1922, the remote farmstead of Hinterkaifeck in Germany became the site of one of the country's most infamous and perplexing unsolved murders. The crime involved the brutal killing of 6 members of the Gruber family, along with their maid, in a case that has since become a classic example of unexplained domestic homicide. The isolation of the farm, the strange preceding events, and the meticulous nature of the investigation combined to create a mystery that endures nearly a century later. Hinterkaifeck was a small, isolated farm located several kilometers from the nearest village. The occupants included Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, her 2 children Kazilia and Joseph, and the family's maid Maria Baumgartner, who had recently begun work at the farm. Andreas was known as a hard-working man, diligent in his farming, while Victoria had returned to live with her parents after the death of her husband. The household was tight-knit, accustomed to the routines of farm life, yet aware of the isolation that defined their daily existence. In the days preceding the murders, neighbors reported unusual occurrences. Andreas mentioned hearing strange noises in the attic, footsteps that did not correspond to the family, and objects that appeared to move on their own. There were rumors of a trespasser, though no one could identify who it might have been. The family expressed unease but took no significant action, as was typical in an era when rural isolation often required self-reliance and caution rather than external intervention. On the morning of March 4th, the Gruber family and their maid were found dead, killed with a pickaxe. The crime scene was chilling in its details. Andreas and Kazilia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, her children, and Maria Baumgartner were all discovered in the house or nearby, bludgeoned with extreme force. The methodical nature of the killings suggested that the perpetrator had control, timing, and knowledge of the farm's layout. Despite the severity of the attack, investigators noted that nothing was stolen, and the farm appeared otherwise undisturbed, indicating a motive that was not financial. The days leading up to the murders revealed further peculiarities. Food had been removed from the home, indicating that the killer may have been present before the act. Neighbors noted smoke from the chimney, footprints in the snow leading to and from the farm, and a sense that someone had been on the property without the family's awareness. These details suggested that the murders were not a spontaneous act, but the culmination of observation and planning. Investigators from the local authorities began a meticulous examination of the farmstead. They questioned neighbors, searched for physical evidence, and reconstructed the timeline as best as possible. The pickaxe, the weapon used in the killings, became a central element in the investigation. Its size, reach, and weight indicated that the assailant needed both strength and familiarity with the tool to carry out the murders efficiently. Yet no fingerprints or identifying marks could be conclusively attributed to a suspect, and the snowy conditions of the surrounding area destroyed some of the potential trail. Suspicion fell on several local individuals, including those with known disputes with the family or criminal records. Theories range from revenge for personal grievances, an inheritance dispute, to more elaborate hypotheses involving strangers or itinerants passing through the region. However, each line of inquiry proved inconclusive. The combination of isolation, lack of witnesses, and deliberate planning left investigators without a clear suspect. One of the enduring mysteries of Hinterkaifeck is the behavior of the family immediately before their deaths. Andreas's reports of noises in the attic, footprints in the snow, and objects moving suggest that the killer may have been observing the family for days. The fact that they continued their daily routines despite this perceived presence raises questions about awareness, psychology, and the family's interpretation of warning signs. Some theories suggest that the family may have interacted with the perpetrator without realizing the danger, a chilling possibility that underscores the vulnerability of isolation. The aftermath of the murders created both local and national shock. The brutality and unexplained nature of the crime captured headlines, while investigators struggled to make progress. Despite interviewing numerous potential suspects, the combination of minimal evidence and lack of motive left the case unsolved. The farm itself, later demolished, became a symbol of unresolved violence, curiosity, and fear, a physical representation of a crime that could not be definitively explained. Over the decades, the Hinterkaifeck murders have inspired speculation, analysis, and cultural attention. True crime historians and writers have explored the possibilities: a relative seeking revenge, a neighbor with a grudge, a drifter passing through, or even a disturbed local resident acting impulsively. Yet none of these hypotheses have been confirmed, and the case remains one of the most infamous unsolved murders in German history. Modern forensic analysis has revisited the case, examining archival evidence, photographs, and documents. While the passage of time has limited the potential for DNA or physical verification, behavioral and historical analyses continue to shed light on patterns that may indicate motive, opportunity, and risk. The case serves as an enduring study in the challenges of investigating violent crime in isolated locations, particularly when witnesses are absent and the perpetrator acts with deliberation. The Hinterkaifeck murders are remarkable not only for their violence, but also for the psychological dimensions of the case. The notion of a killer living undetected in proximity to the victims, observing their routines, and striking at the moment of maximum control conveys a level of premeditation that is both extraordinary and unsettling. For contemporary observers, the story functions as a cautionary tale that the ordinary rhythms of life, no matter how secure they may seem, can be disrupted by the deliberate actions of another. In reflecting on Hinterkaifeck today, one can imagine the snow-covered farmstead, the quiet hills of Bavaria, and the seemingly safe domestic environment that was transformed into a scene of horror. The case is preserved in memory, research, and retellings, not only because of its brutality, but because it illustrates the intersection of isolation, human behavior, and violence. The Gruber family, ordinary in every sense, became the center of an extraordinary and unsolved crime. Their deaths a lingering question for investigators, historians, and the public alike. Hinterkaifeck's enduring fascination lies in its combination of meticulous detail, ambiguity, and historical context. The murders challenge our understanding of motive, opportunity, and risk in rural settings, emphasizing that even familiar spaces can harbor hidden dangers. They remind us that crime is not always immediately comprehensible, and that the human desire for explanation often confronts evidence that is incomplete, absent, or ambiguous. Ultimately, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved, a testament to the limits of human understanding when faced with careful planning and isolation. The story continues to resonate, drawing attention to the fragility of domestic security, the potential for unseen threats, and the enduring power of mystery. In the quiet hills of Bavaria, the memory of the Gruber family persists, a narrative of tragedy, fear, and unresolved questions that continues to haunt those who study and reflect upon it. In 1897, in the rural hills of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, a death occurred that would become one of the most unusual cases in American legal history. It was a case in which a ghost, or at least the claim of one, played a central role, not in the sensational sense of horror, but as a crucial witness in a small community struggling to understand a sudden and mysterious death. The story begins with Elva Zona Hester, a young woman born and raised in the Greenbrier Valley. Zona was 19 when she married Edward Booth, a local man known to neighbors as quiet and reserved, but who also carried a temper. At first, their marriage appeared normal, even happy, though some townspeople recalled occasional arguments between the two. Zona lived with her mother, Maggie Hester, in a modest home a few miles from the county seat. On the evening of January 23, 1897, Zona fell ill. She complained of severe stomach pains and dizziness. Her mother tended to her through the night, providing care and comfort. But by morning, Zona was dead. Her body was cold, her breathing gone, Edward Booth claimed she had succumbed to natural causes, a sudden illness, perhaps. The local physician examined her, recorded her death as due to natural causes, and the body was buried quickly, as was customary in rural areas during winter months. The funeral was solemn, but Maggie Hester could not accept the official account. Zona had been healthy, vibrant, and full of life. Her sudden death seemed inexplicable. In the days that followed, Maggie began to claim that Zona had appeared to her in a series of dreams. In these visions, Zona's spirit described her own death in vivid detail. She said that Edward Booth had killed her by striking her in the head and neck, and that he had hidden the evidence to make it appear as though she had died naturally. At first, the neighbors thought Maggie was grief-stricken, speaking in the fevered imagination of a mother who had lost her child. But she was insistent. The details Zona's spirit provided were precise, naming locations of bruises and injuries, and describing actions that were not immediately visible to anyone else. Maggie approached the county authorities, urging them to reopen the case, though she faced skepticism from law enforcement and the medical community. After persistent appeals, an exhumation of Zona's body was authorized. When the grave was opened, the findings were shocking. Medical examination revealed clear signs of trauma, bruising on the head and neck consistent with strangulation or blunt force injury, injuries that had been missed in the initial evaluation. The body showed evidence that contradicted Edward Booth's claims of sudden illness. What Maggie had described, and what she said were the instructions of her daughter's ghost, matched the forensic reality precisely. The evidence was presented to the county prosecutor, who had no choice but to investigate further. Edward Booth was arrested and charged with murder. During the trial, Maggie Hester testified to the visions she had experienced. She described Zona's appearance in her dreams, the calm but insistent details of her death, and the instructions to identify the specific injuries. The testimony was unusual, even unprecedented, but it added a layer of credibility because the exhumed body corroborated her statements. Booth's defense attempted to dismiss the claims as superstition and emotional hysteria, but the jury faced a clear set of facts. A sudden death initially deemed natural, an exhumation revealing fatal injuries, and a witness, a mother, whose testimony had predicted the evidence before it was found. In an extraordinary judgment, Edward Booth was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, and the case became part of legal history for the unique role that alleged supernatural guidance played in uncovering the truth. The Greenbrier ghost case is often remembered for its sensational elements: the ghostly apparition, the dreams, and the insistence of a grieving mother that her child's death was not natural. But in quieter reflection, it is also a story of community, persistence, and the intersection of belief and evidence. Maggie Hester's actions were motivated by a determination to see justice done, and the visions of her daughter became a framework for investigation that combined intuition with observable fact. Historians have noted that while the story contains elements of the supernatural, it is grounded in a practical reality. Zona's death was real, her injuries verifiable, and the criminal actions of Edward Booth undeniable. The ghost serves less as a fantastical element and more as a narrative device, a reminder that sometimes the truth is first perceived in ways that are not immediately accepted, that insight can precede formal proof, and that human attention, vigilance, and persistence can uncover what initially seems hidden. In the decades since, the Greenbrier ghost has remained a subject of fascination for both legal scholars and those interested in unusual folklore. It is cited as one of the few instances in U.S. history in which alleged supernatural testimony played a direct role in a criminal conviction. More broadly, it continues to illustrate the ways in which human perception, grief, and attention to detail can intersect with investigative procedure, leading to justice even under improbable circumstances. Standing today in Greenbrier County, one can imagine the winter nights of 1897, a young woman lying ill in her modest home, her mother vigilant and attentive, and a community caught between daily routine and the unsettling realization that evil sometimes hides in plain sight. The story of Zona Hester and Edward Booth endures because it is both simple and extraordinary: a sudden death, a mother's devotion, and a truth revealed in ways that could not have been predicted. It is not a tale of fear or horror, but of quiet determination, of a small community wrestling with loss and justice, and of the enduring human impulse to seek truth, no matter how strange the path may seem. In that sense, The Greenbrier Ghost is less about ghosts at all, and more about the ways in which human perception, memory, and vigilance can illuminate hidden realities, even when the evidence itself is buried beneath layers of assumption and grief.